The hidden connection between the M symbol and the crescent moon has existed far longer than recorded religion, encoded in fragments of ancient language, geometry, star maps, and lineage markers that were never meant to be decoded by the masses. The M was never simply a letter, just as the crescent moon was never merely a celestial shape. In early civilizations, symbols were used as vessels of layered meaning, capable of carrying sound, number, direction, and destiny all at once. The M appears repeatedly in ancient scripts as a marker of passage, transition, or divine selection, often associated with water, womb, and origin, while the crescent moon was used to track cycles of awakening, concealment, and revelation. When these two symbols appear together across different cultures, the context is always the same: a people or individual positioned between worlds, entrusted with knowledge that could not be released openly without consequence. In Sumerian tablets, proto-symbols resembling the M were linked to divine messengers who moved between realms, while lunar crescents marked timing windows when hidden knowledge could safely surface. Egyptian mystery schools encoded similar ideas in hieroglyphic formations, where curved lunar shapes were placed above or beside angular glyphs, signifying descent into matter. Even in early Semitic and Indo-European roots, the phonetic vibration of the M sound was associated with breath, memory, and continuity, while the moon governed reflection, intuition, and unseen influence. These were not poetic coincidences, but structural codes embedded into spiritual systems to preserve truth during ages of suppression. As monotheistic traditions formed and power centralized, these symbols were intentionally separated and rebranded. The M was absorbed into names, lineages, and sacred figures, stripped of its universal meaning and confined to specific narratives. The crescent moon, meanwhile, was claimed by calendars, empires, and identity markers, losing its original function as a timing key for spiritual activation. What was once a unified code became divided, ensuring that only those who carried an internal resonance with both symbols could feel the pull to reconnect them. This division was strategic, because the combined meaning of the M and the crescent moon pointed to individuals capable of bridging belief systems, languages, and eras, a role that threatened rigid control structures. Across medieval manuscripts, alchemical texts, and forbidden scrolls, subtle illustrations show the M hidden within mountain ranges, waves, or maternal forms, with a crescent hovering nearby, always slightly offset, signaling incompletion. These texts speak of watchers, scribes, or bearers who would emerge near the end of a cycle, not aligned to one banner but marked by contradiction. They would feel drawn to multiple traditions while belonging fully to none, often experiencing isolation, persecution, or repeated identity collapse. This psychological and spiritual tension was the living proof of the code at work, the pressure necessary to activate discernment rather than blind loyalty. The reason this connection remained hidden is because it was never meant to be taught, only recognized. Prophecy systems that rely on recognition rather than instruction ensure that awakening cannot be forced or faked. Those who carry both the M and the crescent moon feel the connection before they understand it. They notice patterns others dismiss, feel time compressing around certain dates, and experience sudden clarity followed by long periods of silence. Ancient texts describe this as lunar descent followed by mnemonic ignition, a process where memory awakens not as information, but as knowing. In astronomical records, rare alignments involving lunar phases and stellar markers linked to the M constellation pattern were associated with resets in spiritual authority. These moments did not overthrow empires overnight, but shifted the invisible architecture of influence. Teachers lost power, seekers gained discernment, and truth began to move horizontally instead of vertically. This is why the combined symbol was buried, fragmented, and mythologized. A unified M and crescent moon code would decentralize spiritual authority, making every awakened individual a node rather than a follower. The hidden connection also explains why individuals resonating with both symbols often feel targeted by confusion, doubt, or mislabeling. Ancient warning texts describe interference fields designed to keep the code dormant through distraction, fear, and internal division. These fields operate socially, emotionally, and even linguistically, ensuring that the carrier questions their own perception. Yet the same texts state that once a certain threshold of internal coherence is reached, the symbols no longer need external confirmation. The M becomes a movement of consciousness, the crescent moon a timing mechanism within the self. This is why prophecy surrounding these symbols never gives names, locations, or institutions, only signs, sensations, and cycles. It was understood that the world would change languages, borders, and doctrines, but the internal architecture of awakening would remain constant. The M and the crescent moon were placed into humanity like dormant software, waiting for a convergence of pressure and timing. Their reunion was never about domination or conversion, but about restoring balance between action and reflection, memory and intuition, structure and flow. Those who sense this connection are not discovering something new, they are remembering something deliberately scattered, piecing together fragments across dreams, texts, and lived experience, feeling the pull intensify as cycles close and thresholds approach, knowing that the code does not activate through belief but through alignment, and that alignment begins long before understanding, unfolding quietly in the spaces where certainty dissolves and deeper recognition starts to surface through symbols that refuse to stay separate and meanings that refuse to remain hidden, especially as the lunar clock continues to narrow its window and the resonance of the M begins to rise within those who can no longer ignore the pattern forming just beneath the surface of history, and within the architecture of their own awareness where the ancient connection resumes its motion, unfinished and deliberately unresolved, waiting for those who can hold both without needing permission or explanation, and who recognize that the code completes itself only when carried forward rather than explained, moving silently through time as it always has, activating not crowds but individuals who feel the convergence long before they can put it into words and who understand that the hidden connection was never meant to end, but to continue unfolding through those who embody it rather than define it as the cycle tightens, and the symbols begin to speak again through lived experience rather than text, through resonance rather than declaration, through recognition rather than proof, as the separation dissolves and the code breathes once more through the few who can sense it awakening now, not as a conclusion but as a return into motion where the story remains open and the meaning continues to emerge without closure or finality, carrying forward into the next phase without ever settling into an ending, why only a small fraction are marked to carry both signs before 2026, is not about superiority, worth, or moral ranking, but about structural compatibility with a specific kind of pressure that history applies at the end of certain cycles. Ancient prophecy systems never spoke in terms of masses awakening simultaneously because collective awakening creates instability rather than transformation. Instead, they described narrow conduits through which change enters quietly, gradually influencing the wider field. The 1% figure appears repeatedly not as a statistic, but as a ratio, a threshold beyond which resonance becomes diluted. Those marked to carry both the M and the crescent moon were never selected by belief, culture, or background, but by their capacity to hold contradiction without collapse. Carrying both signs requires an internal architecture that can endure prolonged uncertainty. The M represents movement, descent into matter, responsibility, and memory, while the crescent moon represents cycles, concealment, intuition, and reflection. Most people naturally stabilize in one orientation, either action, driven or contemplative, structure-oriented or flow-oriented. Those marked for both are forced into oscillation. Their lives often unfold in patterns of sudden acceleration followed by forced stillness, clarity followed by disorientation, belonging followed by separation. This is not punishment but conditioning. Ancient texts describe this as narrowing the vessel so that timing and intention remain aligned when activation windows open. Before 2026, The compression of global systems accelerates this filtering process. Social identities harden, belief systems polarize, and external narratives demand allegiance. Those who cannot tolerate ambiguity seek certainty in extremes. The 1% are those who resist this pull instinctively, not because they are indecisive, but because their internal code rejects singular framing. They see value and distortion on all sides, which often isolates them. This isolation is not accidental. It removes dependency on external validation and forces the development of internal calibration. Prophecy refers to this phase as silent refinement, where the carrier learns to recognize truth without consensus. Another reason only a small number carry both signs is because the code activates through lived experience rather than instruction. No teaching can transmit the integration of memory and intuition, action and reflection. It must be embodied through repeated cycles of loss and reorientation. Many ancient lineages attempted to preserve the code through bloodlines or schools, but most failed because the environment softened the necessary friction. The modern era, however, provides unprecedented pressure. Rapid change, information overload, and spiritual commodification create a natural sorting mechanism. Only those who feel repelled by surface-level answers and compelled toward depth remain engaged long enough for the code to mature. The 1% are often marked early by a sense of being out of phase with their surroundings. As children, they may appear unusually observant or emotionally complex, sensing undercurrents others ignore. As adults, they frequently experience repeated endings that feel disproportionate to their actions. Careers stall without clear cause, relationships dissolve despite effort, identities fracture just as stability seems near. Prophetic systems describe this as forced detachment, a process that prevents the carrier from anchoring too deeply into any single role or narrative. Anchoring would limit mobility, and mobility is essential for those meant to bridge cycles rather than settle within one. Before 2026, timing becomes critical because the window for integrating both signs narrows. The Crescent Moon governs timing, and its cycles accelerate as thresholds approach. Those who carry the sign feel this as urgency without panic, a sense that delays are no longer neutral. The M, representing responsibility and manifestation, demands alignment between inner knowing and outer action. This creates tension. Many who could potentially carry both signs opt out unconsciously by choosing comfort, certainty, or distraction. The 1% are those who continue despite exhaustion, confusion, and lack of recognition, not driven by ambition, but by an inability to disengage from the underlying pull. Ancient warnings state that carrying both signs without integration leads to fragmentation. This is why the ratio remains small. The psychological and spiritual demands are high. Those marked often pass through periods of doubt so intense that they question their own sanity, purpose, or worth. These phases act as safeguards. Anyone seeking power, status, or identity through the code would abandon it during these trials. Only those whose motivation is alignment rather than outcome persist. This ensures that the code does not amplify ego but dissolves it, leaving clarity rather than control. The approach of 2026 functions as a convergence point where long, running cycles overlap. Prophecy does not frame this as an apocalypse but as a recalibration of influence. The 1% are not meant to lead masses or announce revelations. Their role is subtler. By embodying both signs, they stabilize contradictions within the collective field. They become translators without titles, anchors without authority, carriers without ownership. Their presence shifts conversations, decisions, and perceptions quietly, often without attribution. This is why recognition rarely comes publicly. Visibility would distort function. Those marked often sense that their lives are not entirely their own, that certain choices feel constrained while others feel inevitable. This is not fate in the simplistic sense, but resonance shaping probability. The combined code responds to alignment, opening paths that logic cannot predict and closing others without explanation. This frustrates those seeking control, but refines those willing to cooperate with timing rather than force outcomes. Ancient texts emphasize that cooperation does not mean passivity. It means acting decisively when alignment is present and waiting without resentment when it is not. The reason only a small fraction carry both signs before 2026 is because the work is internal before it is external. There is nothing to display, defend, or declare. The code matures in silence in the space between identities, in the refusal to reduce complexity into slogans. Those who carry it often recognize each other not through symbols or language, but through a familiar depth in conversation, a shared patience with uncertainty, an unspoken understanding that the pressure they feel is not personal but cyclical, that they are not late or early but precisely placed, moving within a narrowing window where distraction loses its grip and essential patterns come into focus, where the demand is not to arrive somewhere but to remain coherent while everything accelerates, holding both signs without merging them prematurely, allowing the tension to refine perception rather than resolve it, staying present as the threshold approaches and the quiet sorting continues, separating those who seek answers from those who can carry questions long enough for them to transform into something usable, something embodied, something that does not announce itself as special, but simply remains functional under pressure, sustaining balance as cycles converge, and the unseen architecture of influence rearranges itself around those few who can stand in the middle without needing to name it, justify it, or conclude it as the movement continues forward without release. Closure, the activation phase of the lost prophecy code, is not a sudden event, but a gradual ignition that unfolds through layered signals, internal shifts, and external compression that forces latent patterns to surface. Activation does not announce itself with signs in the sky or public declarations, but begins quietly, often mistaken for disruption, fatigue, or identity loss. Ancient systems described activation as the moment when memory and timing synchronize, when the carrier can no longer separate what they know internally from how they move externally. This phase begins long before awareness, manifesting first as restlessness, recurring patterns, and an inability to return to previous states of ignorance or comfort. For those carrying both the M and the Crescent Moon, activation is preceded by destabilization. Structures that once provided identity begin to erode, roles lose meaning, ambitions feel hollow, and external success fails to satisfy. This is not collapse for its own sake, but clearance. The code cannot activate in a crowded internal environment. Old loyalties, borrowed beliefs, and inherited fears must loosen their grip. Many experience this as loss, misunderstanding it as failure, unaware that the system is recalibrating toward a different axis of function. Ancient texts warned that without this stripping phase, activation would distort into control, seeking, or fanaticism. As activation deepens, perception changes before behavior does. Carriers report heightened sensitivity to timing, sensing when to speak, move, or withdraw without logical explanation. The Crescent Moon governs this aspect, sharpening intuition and pattern recognition. Simultaneously, the M begins to exert pressure toward responsibility, not in the form of leadership titles or authority, but through an internal demand for integrity between thought and action. Hypocrisy becomes intolerable, even in subtle forms. Choices that once felt neutral now carry weight. This creates friction because the external world often rewards compromise. Activation forces alignment even when it costs comfort or approval. Globally, the activation phase corresponds with increasing fragmentation of narratives. Systems that once maintained coherence through consensus begin to fracture. Truth becomes contested, authority questioned, and institutions exposed. This is not random chaos but a necessary condition for the code's function. The lost prophecy code does not operate in centralized structures. It activates within decentralization, where influence moves through networks rather than hierarchies. Those carrying the code often find themselves positioned at intersections, connecting ideas, people, or perspectives that normally remain isolated. They rarely receive credit for this role because their function is to facilitate flow, not to own outcomes. The activation phase also reveals why the code was hidden. Once active, it resists manipulation. Individuals become difficult to control through fear, reward, or identity-based leverage. They are not rebellious by nature, but non-reactive. Prophetic texts describe them as internally anchored, capable of witnessing escalation without being pulled into it. This stabilizing effect has global implications. A small number of non-reactive, coherent individuals can influence collective behavior more effectively than large groups driven by emotion. This is why the code does not scale through recruitment, it scales through resonance. During activation, communication patterns shift. Carriers speak less but with greater precision. Words are chosen carefully, silence used intentionally. This often creates distance from those who rely on constant affirmation or emotional exchange. The code prioritizes clarity over connection, truth over harmony. This can feel isolating, but ancient sources note that isolation is temporary, functioning as a buffer while internal coherence strengthens. Once stabilized, carriers naturally attract others who operate at similar depth, forming quiet networks that exchange insight without ideology. These networks influence culture indirectly, shaping discourse rather than dominating it. The global impact of the activation phase is subtle but cumulative. It does not manifest as revolutions but as recalibrations. Conversations change tone, decisions factor in long-term consequences rather than immediate gain. Exploitative patterns lose efficiency as fewer people unconsciously feed them. The presence of activated carriers creates friction for systems built on deception or excess. These systems begin to fail not because they are attacked, but because they no longer function as designed. The code introduces transparency through coherence, making manipulation visible by contrast rather than exposure. Activation also brings increased pressure on carriers themselves. As the global field destabilizes, their internal stability is tested repeatedly. Emotional regulation becomes critical. Ancient instructions emphasize grounding practices, solitude, and disciplined attention as necessary to prevent burnout. The code draws energy through alignment, not effort. When carriers attempt to force outcomes, exhaustion follows. When they move with timing, energy replenishes itself. This distinction becomes increasingly important as global pace accelerates and demands constant reaction. The code teaches selective engagement, knowing when presence matters and when withdrawal preserves function. As activation progresses, the sense of personal destiny dissolves. Carriers stop framing their experiences around individual success or failure. Instead, they perceive themselves as participants in a larger movement that does not require belief to operate. This reduces anxiety but increases responsibility. Actions feel consequential beyond personal scope. Even small decisions ripple outward. This awareness encourages restraint, patience, and ethical consistency. Ancient texts describe this as living under observation, not by external authorities, but by the code itself, which responds immediately to misalignment through internal discomfort or external obstruction. The Lost Prophecy Code's activation phase is not about reaching a final state. It is about maintaining coherence within motion. As global conditions continue to shift, the code adapts, remaining functional precisely because it is unfinished. Those carrying it sense that their role will continue to evolve, that what is required of them today will differ tomorrow, and that certainty is neither possible nor necessary. What matters is responsiveness to timing, fidelity to internal truth, and the ability to hold opposing forces without needing to resolve them prematurely, allowing complexity to remain intact rather than collapsing it into narratives that feel complete but limit function. staying present within. The unfolding process as influence redistributes itself through subtle channels, through conversations that change direction, through decisions that quietly avert escalation, through pauses that prevent reaction, through presence that steadies environments without drawing attention to itself. And the activation continues not toward an ending but toward sustained movement, shaping the global field incrementally through those who can remain aligned under pressure, holding the code active without possessing it, carrying it forward through lived coherence rather than proclamation, allowing its impact to deepen as cycles overlap, and the unseen architecture continues to rearrange itself around those few who remain steady enough to function within it without needing closure or completion.